The letter arrived on a Tuesday, in the second week of November, when Dorset lay under a sky the color of old pewter, and the lanes between Ashmore Village and Hartwell Park had turned to cold mud. Miss Cecily Vane did not open it immediately. She set it on the hall table of the rectory, beside the candle stub and her father's old sermon notes, and went on removing her gloves, one finger at a time. The seal was unfamiliar, pressed in red wax with a device she could not name, and the handwriting on the direction was neither the solicitor's cramped script nor anything she recognized. The letter had come a long way. She could tell by the creases, by the faint stain at one corner that spoke of a long journey in a wet dispatch bag, her name on the face of it, Miss Cecily Vane, the Old Rectory, Ashmore, Dorset. Not Miss Vane, late of Hartwell Park, not Miss Vane, formerly companion to the Dowager Duchess of Hartwell. Just Cecily, plain as bread. She had been plain as bread for 8 months. 8 months since she had been dismissed from Hartwell Park with a single trunk, 40 pounds, and Lady Dorothea Ashford's cool assurance that a woman of her station, in her circumstances, ought to count herself fortunate to have been kept on as long as she had. Cecily picked up the letter. She carried it to the sitting room, where the fire had burned to ash, and she stood by the cold grate and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet, written in the same unfamiliar hand, and 3 words changed everything she thought she knew about the past 8 months. Henry Ashford lives. She sat down. She sat down on the floor beside the cold grate, because her legs did not consult her wishes, and she read the letter twice, and then a 3rd time, with the kind of careful attention one gives to something one is certain one has misread. Henry Ashford, 3rd son of the late Duke of Hartwell, reported dead at Salamanca 4 years ago. The grief that had dimmed his brother Gideon's eyes behind that careful reserve. The portrait in the long gallery, draped in black. The younger brother's absence that had grown into a shape all its own inside the walls of Hartwell Park. The letter was brief. It informed her that Mr. Ashford had returned to England 6 weeks prior and had lately discovered that certain matters pertaining to his father's estate had not been settled as the late Duke had instructed. It requested in terms that were polite but carried the faint quality of urgency that Miss Vane attend a meeting at the offices of Messrs. Crowe and Finch in Dorchester at her earliest convenience. There was a postscript in a different ink, written after the main body of the letter had been composed and dried. It read, "I am told you kept the letters safe. My brother does not know I have written to you. Come." The fire was cold. Outside, the November wind pressed at the old rectory windows. She folded the letter along its original creases and set it in her lap, and she let herself feel, for the first time in 8 months, something other than the low gray weight of endurance. She felt afraid. She felt the particular species of fear that comes not from danger, but from hope, because she had learned, in the past 8 months, that hope was the thing most likely to hurt her. She had been a fool to hope once before. She would not, she told herself, make the same mistake again. She went to bed that night, and she slept badly. And in the morning, she hired the rector's gig and drove to Dorchester. It had begun 18 months before Cecily's dismissal. In the early spring of a season that Hartwell Park had held at arm's length, as it held most things, she had come to the house as companion to the Dowager Duchess, Lady Dorothea, after the death of Cecily's father left the rectory and its modest living in the hands of the church, and left Cecily herself with a respectable name, a better education than most women of her reduced station, and no money to speak of. The living had been adequate for a rector. It was not adequate for a rector's orphaned daughter. Lady Dorothea had required a woman of some cultivation who could bear to be looked over and spoken past, and Cecily had required a roof and a wage. The arrangement suited both parties, though it suited Lady Dorothea considerably better. The Dowager Duchess was a woman of great precision and very little warmth. She had organized her feelings as one might organize a linen press, each one folded flat and stored out of sight, retrieved only when the occasion absolutely demanded it, and returned immediately after. She had loved her husband in this way. She had loved her sons in this way. She had managed her grief at Henry's reported death in precisely the same manner. She had taken it out, examined it at the funeral, and replaced it behind closed doors, where it would not be inconvenient to anyone. Her elder son, Gideon Ashford, the 5th Duke of Hartwell, was 32 when Cecily arrived, and he was already everything the household expected of him. He ran the estate with the same contained efficiency he applied to all things. He answered his correspondence. He attended to his tenants. He appeared at dinner precisely on time and left the table precisely when it was reasonable to do so. And in between, he said very little that was not necessary. The staff said he had been different before Salamanca. Cecily had not known him before Salamanca. She knew only the man who stood at the head of the dining-room table and spoke to the assembled household in a voice so level it carried no warmth, and whose eyes, when they occasionally moved in her direction, held nothing she could name with any confidence. He was not unkind to her. He was not, precisely, anything to her. She was his mother's companion. She catalogued books in the library when the Dowager Duchess was occupied elsewhere, and she accompanied Lady Dorothea on calls. And she sat in the drawing-room with her needlework and listened to the house breathe around her. There was a morning in late June, perhaps 3 months after Cecily arrived, when she found him in the library before breakfast. She had not expected anyone. The room at that hour was her particular domain, cool and quiet. The shelves running floor to ceiling on 3 walls, the tall windows admitting the early summer light in long, pale columns. She came in with her catalogue notebook, and she stopped in the doorway. And he was standing at the window with a letter in his hands. And he had not heard her. She watched him for a moment. She should not have taken. His back was to her, but she could see the angle of his jaw in profile and the letter in his hands, and the way his hands were not quite still. The paper trembled very slightly, in a way it would not have done if his hands had been as composed as the rest of him. He turned. He saw her. Whatever she had witnessed in that 2 seconds was gone. "Miss Vane," he said. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said. "I did not know the room was occupied." He folded the letter without looking down at it. "It is a library," he said. "It exists to be occupied." She came in and went to her shelf and opened her notebook. He remained at the window for a moment longer. When he left, he set the folded letter on the corner of the reading table, and she saw, without intending to, that it was not in an unfamiliar hand. It was in his own hand, unsealed, the direction on the face of it reading simply, "Captain H. Ashford." A letter written to a dead man. She did not mention it. She catalogued her shelf and went to breakfast and said nothing. But she thought about it. She thought about it in the way one thinks about a thing that has no practical application, and yet refuses to be set aside. She thought about the slight tremble in his hands, the contained composure of a man who had been maintaining it, at great cost, for a long time. She thought, he is not cold. He is very careful. It was the first dangerous thought she had permitted herself. She did not notice it was dangerous until much later. The catalogue of small accumulated attentions did not arrive all at once. That was the nature of them. There was the morning he asked, without practical reason, whether the books she had found in the East Wing corner required rebinding, and stayed to hear the answer at more length than the question strictly warranted. There was the afternoon he appeared in the library doorway to say that the weather had turned, and she had not brought a shawl, and she was in the habit of walking to the village in the late afternoon. It was not a question. She took the shawl his housekeeper produced, and he returned to his study. And she stood with the shawl in her hands for a moment, before she went out. There was the evening Lady Dorothea said, within earshot of the assembled company at the Pendleton dinner, that Cecily had been a governess at her last position, which was not true. Cecily had been a rector's daughter who had educated herself, which was not the same thing at all. And the distinction mattered in a room of this kind, where such categories were the machinery by which people were measured. She had said nothing. She had kept her eyes on her plate. He had said, from across the table, without inflection, that he was unaware of any such history, and that Miss Vane had come to him recommended as a woman of particular attainment. Not a governess. The correction was civil. It was not technically an attack on the Dowager Duchess. It was not technically anything. Lady Dorothea had moved the conversation forward with the ease of a woman who had been doing so for 40 years. Cecily had not looked at him again that evening. There was the morning she found the child. It is perhaps necessary to explain that he had a ward. His name was Edmund. He was 7 years old. He was the orphaned son of a fellow officer, and he lived at Hartwell Park in a condition of quiet invisibility that Cecily recognized from the inside. He was not mistreated. He was maintained, clothed, schooled by a tutor, delivered to the garden in fine weather, and otherwise present in the house without quite being seen by anyone in particular. The morning Cecily found him, he was in the shrubbery at the east end of the parterre, and he was sitting in the mud, with his good coat at risk, and he was crying in the particular way of a child who has learned not to make noise while doing so. She sat down beside him. Not on a bench. On the ground, her own gown and the mud notwithstanding. She did not say, "What is the matter?" or "You must not cry," or any of the things adults said to children who cried. She said, after a moment, "I have found that crying is more efficient when done in a specific location. This shrubbery, for instance, is private and has good cover." The child had looked at her. Then he had said, very quietly, that the boys at school had told him he was a charity case and had no one, and he did not know what to say to that, because it seemed as though they were right. She had thought, for a moment, of her £40 and her single trunk and Lady Dorothea's cool assurance. Then she had said that having no one was, in her experience, a temporary condition rather than a permanent one, and that while it was miserable in the short term, it was also not the final verdict on a person's life, and that she could not promise it would improve immediately, but she could promise it would not stay as it was. She had not known that he had come into the garden looking for the boy. She had not known he was standing 3 yards away in the gap between the yew hedges, entirely still, when she said all of that. She found out, much later, that she had been witnessed. She did not know it that morning. She walked Edmund back to the house, saw him delivered to his tutor, and went on with her day, and none of the dull, ordinary afternoon that followed gave any indication of what had shifted. If anything had shifted. She did not allow herself to believe that it had. The idea of him, she understood, was a luxury she could not afford. He was a duke. She was a rector's daughter without income or connection. The gap between them was not a gap in the ordinary sense. It was the whole structure of the world, organized, maintained, and enforced by the precise mechanisms of every room she had occupied in the past year. Lady Dorothea made this clear, not in explicit terms, because Lady Dorothea did not operate in explicit terms. She made it clear the way she made everything clear, through the careful calibration of small daily reminders. "Miss Vane," she said once to a caller who had inquired, "Cecily is my companion. Quite useful, of course. One always finds these women of reduced circumstances rather eager to please." Cecily had been in the room. She had been in the room, and she had kept her eyes on her needlework, and she had heard the faint emphasis on reduced, and she had understood perfectly the message delivered. She was useful. She was not significant. She was a woman of reduced circumstances, which was to say she was a category, and categories did not invite the romantic interest of dukes. Categories did not inspire the kind of careful, constrained attention she had noticed. Categories did not sit beside small boys in the mud. She had decided firmly that she was misreading the situation, that the shawl had been practical, that the dinner correction had been social, that the letters to a dead man were none of her business. She had decided this, and she had not quite believed it. And then the spring had turned to summer, and the summer to autumn, and Henry had not come back from the dead, and the matter had seemed resolved. Then November came, and the letter came, and everything she thought she knew about the past year unraveled. The offices of Messrs. Crowe and Finch were on a narrow street off the High in Dorchester, and the room in which Cecily was shown to wait was cold and smelled of old paper and the particular dust that accumulates in rooms where documents outlast the people they concern. She waited for 20 minutes. The man who came in was not a solicitor. He was 30 years old, perhaps, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a coat that had been good once and was not good now, and he walked with the careful evenness of a man who had learned to compensate for something. His left hand, she noticed, did not quite close all the way. He had been in the war a long time. "Miss Vane," he said. He stopped some feet away from her and studied her face with a directness that was not rude, but was very intent. "You are exactly as Gideon described you," she said. "I was not aware the Duke had described me to anyone." "Not recently," Henry said, and something passed through his face that might have been regret. 3 years ago, before Salamanca. I had a letter from him in which he mentioned a Miss Vane who had come to assist our mother, and he wrote rather more about her than the subject seemed to require. The room was cold. Cecily kept her hand still in her lap. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "your letter mentioned matters pertaining to your father's estate." He sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. Then he said, "I am going to tell you something that will cause you to be angry on my brother's behalf. I ask that you hear me out before you decide what to do with your anger." She looked at him. He had, she thought, some of Gideon's quality of restrained weight, the sense of a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had grown to the shape of it. She said, "I will hear you." It had begun, Henry explained 4 years ago, when a letter arrived at Hartwell Park from the War Office, informing the family that Captain Ashford had been killed at Salamanca. The letter had been accurate as far as it went. He had been injured at Salamanca. He had been listed as dead by a commanding officer who had made the reasonable assumption and filed the report before the field surgeon corrected it. By the time the correction was made, the original report had already been dispatched, and the correction had not, for reasons Henry described without particular bitterness, been forwarded in any timely manner. He had spent 14 months recovering in Lisbon. He had written, twice, to Hartwell Park. He had received no reply. He had assumed, for some time, that the grief had produced a silence. He had understood. He had waited. It was not until he finally arrived in England, 6 weeks prior to this meeting, that he discovered the letters from Portugal had never been opened. They had been received by a steward who had given them to Lady Dorothea, and Lady Dorothea had set them aside, because she had organized her grief and put it away. And Henry's handwriting on an envelope after 14 months of silence was a thing she could not bring herself to examine. Henry had confronted his mother. It had been, he said quietly, a difficult conversation. There was more. Their father's will had contained a specific bequest to a charitable foundation their father had established in the village, administered through a named trustee. The trustee was to hold the funds in perpetuity for the benefit of the village school and the parish poor relief. The bequest was £3,000, to be paid within 1 year of the Duke's death. It had not been paid. Cecily was very still. The foundation's accounts, Henry said, record £3,000 received from the estate in the first year. The village school and poor relief have received nothing. The funds appear to have passed through the trustee, and not beyond him. The trustee is Mr. Percival Harwood. She knew that name. Percival Harwood had been a frequent caller at Hartwell Park. Lady Dorothea had considered him reliable. Your mother, Cecily said carefully. Was not aware, Henry said. He was precise about this. I believe that entirely. She is not a woman who would tolerate this kind of theft. She is a woman who trusted someone she should not have trusted, and who will have to live with the consequences of that trust. He paused. But there is a difficulty. The difficulty was this. Mr. Harwood was aware of Henry's return. He had learned of it through a solicitor's correspondence that had been less discreet than it should have been. He had, in the 2 weeks since Henry had come to Dorchester to examine the accounts, been making claims. Specifically, the claim that the bequest had been made over in good faith to a series of sub-accounts, and that the shortfall was the result of administrative error, and that Miss Vane, who had maintained the household accounts for the charitable fund during her time at Hartwell Park, was responsible for the discrepancy. Cecily looked at him. The cold room was very quiet. I maintained no such accounts, she said. Her voice was level. Inside her chest, something had gone very still. The stillness of a person who has just understood the shape of the thing coming at her. I know, Henry said, which is why I wrote to you. He reached into his coat and produced a small packet of letters. They were tied with a black ribbon, and Cecily recognized the ribbon before she recognized the letters themselves, because it had been cut from the sleeve lining of a morning gown, and she had been the one to cut it. You kept my father's letters, Henry said. His correspondence to the foundation. Every letter the old Duke wrote in the last 3 years of his life to the trustees, documenting his intentions and the specific designated funds. You kept them. When my mother asked you to clear his study after his death, you kept them in your room, not because you had any reason to suppose they would be needed, but because you could not bring yourself to burn your employer's correspondence. She had kept them because they were a good man's words. Because the old Duke had written with such careful detail of the people he had wished to help. Because burning them had felt, in the cold practicality of that terrible week of clearing and cataloging, like an extinguishment. She had not known she was preserving evidence. May I see them? She said, and he put them in her hands. She opened the topmost letter. The old Duke's handwriting, cramped and deliberate, detailing the exact sum, the exact payees, the exact dates on which disbursements were to begin, his seal on every one, his signature witnessed by 2 parties who were named, £3,000, the school, the poor relief. His specific, detailed, undeniable instructions. Harwood's claim collapsed on the face of it. "He will not withdraw quietly," she said. "No," Henry agreed. "He will not. He will insist that the letters are forgeries, or that their provenance is suspect. He has already communicated as much to his own solicitor." He looked at her steadily. "He will also suggest that a woman who was dismissed from Hartwell Park under ambiguous circumstances is not a credible keeper of sensitive documents." She understood. She had understood from the moment she read the letter in the cold rectory sitting room. The ambiguous circumstances of her dismissal were not, in fact, ambiguous to her. She knew precisely why she had been dismissed. Lady Dorothea had found her in the library with Gideon. He had been reading aloud to her from a volume of natural history, and she had been leaning, very slightly, toward the sound of his voice. And Lady Dorothea had come in at the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on one's perspective, and had seen something she did not wish to have to manage. A week later, the single trunk, the 40 pounds, and the cool assurance. She had not, at the time, imagined that Gideon had known. She had assumed he was told afterward that some version of the dismissal had been explained to him in Lady Dorothea's terms, and that those terms had been sufficient. She had assumed that was the end of it. She said, "Does your brother know any of this?" "Not yet," Henry said. "He is in London. He has been in London for the past 3 weeks, and I have deliberately not written to him, because I did not know what the letters contained until 4 days ago, and I did not wish to send him incomplete information." He paused. "And because I was not sure, until I met you, whether you would be willing to come to Hartwell Park." She looked at him. "Come to Hartwell Park," she said. "Mr. Harwood has requested a formal meeting with the estate's solicitor to present his version of the accounts. It is scheduled for next Friday. Gideon will return for it. The letters are the counter-evidence. You are the woman who kept them. Your testimony as to their provenance, with the letters themselves, is what undoes Harwood's claim." He met her eyes. "You would need to be present, Miss Vane. In the room. In the room. At Hartwell Park. Across a table from Percival Harwood, and whatever arrangement of witnesses and documents he intended to bring. In the same house as Gideon. She had told Edmund, in the cold shrubbery, that reduced circumstances were a temporary condition. She had told him it would not stay as it was. She had believed it. Saying it. She had not, in the 8 months since, found much evidence to support the belief. She said, "I will come." Gideon Ashford arrived at Hartwell Park on the Wednesday, 2 days before the meeting, and he was told immediately by his housekeeper that his brother was in residence and that Miss Vane had returned to the house as a guest. He stood in the entrance hall in his traveling coat for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he went to find Henry. He found him in the library, which was, Henry noted afterward, entirely characteristic. And the conversation that followed was, by Henry's account, one of the more useful they had ever had. It contained a number of things that Gideon had not said in the past 18 months, and Henry had not said in the past 4 years, and it was not comfortable, but it was honest. Cecily heard none of it. She was in her old room, which had been prepared for her arrival, and she sat by the window and watched the park in the early November dusk and tried not to think about what was occurring in other parts of the house. She heard the dinner bell. She went down. He was at the foot of the stairs when she reached the bottom step. He had not taken his usual place at the head of the table. He was standing at the foot of the stairs, and he looked at her with the kind of attention that was difficult to misread. And she thought, immediately and helplessly, of the library in early summer, and the slight tremble of his hands over a letter addressed to a dead man. He said, Miss Vane, she said. Your Grace. There was a small, significant pause. I owe you an explanation, he said, that I should have given 8 months ago, before you left this house. He said it in his usual voice, level and contained, but the words themselves were not his usual kind. I am sorry I did not. I did not know you had been asked to go until after you had gone, and the manner in which I was told was such that I accepted it without the argument it deserved. She held the banister, very slightly, so as not to betray herself. You are not required to apologize, she said. I know, he said. I am not apologizing because I am required to. Henry appeared from the dining room and said that dinner was growing cold, and that whatever this conversation was, it could continue at greater leisure after Harwood had been dealt with, and would they please come and eat. They came and ate. It was not, Cecily thought, one of the more tranquil meals she had attended in that house. Henry talked a great deal, as a man long absent tends to do, filling the silences with Lisbon and the road back through France and the 6 weeks in London. And across the table, Gideon listened to his brother with the particular quality of a man receiving something he had stopped expecting. Once or twice, something close to the feeling she had seen by the library window moved through his face and was contained. Edmund appeared in the doorway before the second remove to ask whether the guest who had arrived was the Miss Vane who had sat with him in the shrubbery, and when it was confirmed that she was, he said that he was glad she had come back and disappeared again before anyone could send him to bed. Cecily said nothing. Her fork was in her hand, and the tine of it pressed very lightly against her thumb, and she did not look at him, and she did not let herself feel the warmth of Edmund's small announcement. She did not let herself. She was not going to be a fool about this a second time. After dinner, with Henry tactfully absent, Gideon asked to see the letters. She gave them to him. He read them in the study where his father had written them, at his father's desk, by candlelight, and she sat in the chair across from him and watched his face and thought how strange it was to be in a room she had been forbidden for 8 months. When he had finished reading, he set the letters down and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How did you know to keep these?" "I did not know," she said. "I kept them because I could not burn them." He looked at her across the desk. The candlelight was not kind to the angles of his face, which were more pronounced than she remembered. And he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the journey from London. "You could have sent them to any solicitor," he said, "or destroyed them after you left, when there was no longer any reason for you to protect this family's interests." She said, "They were your father's words. The people he had wanted to help were still in the village. That had not changed." He looked at her. He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than anything she had planned for. Then he said, "Cecily," her given name. The first time, in 18 months, that he had used it, it landed in the room the way a first note of music lands before any other note has told you what it means. "I have been trying for 8 months to compose a letter to you that contained what needed to be said. I have not managed it. I am not a man who manages this kind of thing with any facility." She sat very still. The candlelight moved. "I was not going to speak before Friday," he said. "It is not the right moment. You are here on a specific matter, and I am aware that pressing my own cause while you are committed to this house's affairs is not what you deserve." She said with the precision of someone who has spent 8 months teaching herself not to hope, and has, perhaps, reached the limits of that lesson. "I would rather know." He was quiet. His hands were on the desk in front of him, and they were not entirely still. She recognized that. "I would like," he said, choosing the words the way one chooses stones to step across a river, "to have the opportunity to make the argument, after Friday, for why you might consider remaining here. Not as my mother's companion, as a different matter altogether." She breathed. The room was very quiet. "Make the argument on Saturday," she said, "and I will hear it." Friday morning came with a hard frost and the sound of Mr. Harwood's carriage on the drive at 10 o'clock sharp. He was a man of perhaps 50, well dressed in the Regency manner, with a solicitor at his side and a confidence in the set of his shoulders that spoke of long experience of rooms in which his version of events had generally prevailed. He had brought a ledger. He had brought 3 letters, signed in a hand very like the old Duke's, that purported to document authorized transfers. He had not, apparently, known about the original letters Cecily held. He had not known she would be in the room. He saw her when he entered, and for the briefest interval something moved through his face that was not quite calculation, but was the precursor to it. Lady Dorothea was present, seated to one side with the rigid posture of a woman who was maintaining her composure by sheer force of long habit. Henry sat beside the estate's solicitor. Gideon stood at the window, his back to the room, until Harwood was seated, and then he turned and took the chair at the head of the table. Cecily sat where Henry had placed her, at Gideon's right hand, with the letters in their black ribbon on the table before her. Harwood began. He was smooth and methodical. He had, he said, carried out his responsibilities as trustee with great conscientiousness. The £3,000 had been managed through sub-accounts that had experienced administrative difficulty during the period of uncertainty following the late Duke's death. The suggestion of impropriety was one he could not allow to stand. As for the question of documentation, he had here, he said, 3 letters from the late Duke authorizing adjustments to the disbursement schedule. He set the letters on the table. Gideon looked at them without touching them. Then he looked at Cecily. She opened the letters from the black ribbon. She set them beside Harwood's 3. She said, "The Duke's correspondence regarding this foundation spans the last 3 years of his life. I maintained his study during that period, and I preserved his letters on this subject at the time of his death. There are 14 letters here. They include his specific instructions as to the payees, the schedule, and the total sum. They are dated, witnessed, and sealed. I can speak to where each one was found, and by whom." Harwood said that letters of uncertain provenance, preserved by a woman who had been let go from this household under difficult circumstances, were hardly compelling. Lady Dorothea spoke then. It was the first thing she had said since the meeting began, and her voice was not her usual careful instrument. It was quieter than that, and it cost her something. She said, "Mr. Harwood, I dismissed Miss Vane from this household because I was afraid of what I saw happening between her and my son. I was wrong to do so in the manner I did, and I was wrong to allow you to make implications about her character. She is, in my experience, entirely trustworthy. She was my companion for 18 months, and I did not once, in all of that time, have reason to question her conduct." The room was very still. Harwood said something further about sub-accounts and administrative process, but the words had lost their purchase. The estate's solicitor examined the 14 letters with great care for 20 minutes, comparing dates and seals and signatures against the 3 Harwood had produced. He set Harwood's 3 aside. He said, in the measured tone of a man used to delivering uncomfortable truths in formal settings, that he would require the original sub-account ledgers to be produced in full, and that this matter would be referred to the appropriate authorities. Harwood was still. One could see, in the line of his jaw, the precise moment his version of events understood it was no longer tenable. He said that this was an outrage. Gideon said from the head of the table, in the level voice that had always carried a particular kind of weight. "The ledgers will be produced, Mr. Harwood. My solicitor will accompany you to ensure they are produced in their entirety. Lady Dorothea's charitable foundation will receive the £3,000 within 30 days, with interest accrued. The children at the village school are owed 4 years of delayed provision. That will be addressed first." Harwood left. His solicitor left. The meeting concluded with the quiet procedural tidiness of a thing that had been resolved by facts rather than performance. In the entrance hall, as the carriages were called, Henry touched Cecily briefly on the elbow and said, "Well done." He said it with the directness of a man who had been saying difficult true things for several weeks and had found the practice useful. She stood in the entrance hall after everyone had dispersed, with the November light coming through the long windows, and she thought about the 14 letters in their black ribbon, and the old Duke who had written them, and the small school in the village where the children had been learning without the books he had intended for them. She thought about Edmund in the shrubbery. She thought about his hands, not entirely still, over a letter written to a dead man who was not dead. Lady Dorothea found her there. The Dowager Duchess of Hartwell stood in the entrance hall and looked at Cecily with the particular expression of a woman who has been wrong in a way that matters and knows it, and has decided to say so while the decision still requires courage. She said, "I have been, in the matter of my son, very foolish. I did not dislike you, Cecily. I was afraid that he would lose himself in something that would not serve the estate or the family, and I managed that fear in the way I manage most things that frighten me." Cecily looked at her. She thought of £40 and a single trunk, and the word reduced, spoken with the faintest of emphasis. She said, "I understand, Lady Dorothea." And she did. She understood the machinery. It had never been about her in particular. It had been about the categories and the order, and the careful management of a grief that had already cost this family more than it ought to have. "I am telling you this," Lady Dorothea said, "because my son has not spoken to me since Wednesday evening in any terms that did not pertain to Harwood, but I am not so obtuse as to be uncertain of the direction of things, and I wish to say it to you before the direction is settled." She left. She left in the way she did everything, precisely and without lingering. Saturday came cold and clear, the November sky stripped of cloud for the first time in a week. The park at Hartwell caught in the low, pale light that makes old stone look like it is lit from within. Gideon found her on the terrace, where she had gone after breakfast with no particular plan other than the need for cold air and the low blue distance of the hills. He came out without a coat, which was not characteristic, and she thought, he has been waiting for the right moment, and then decided the right moment was simply now. He stood beside her at the stone balustrade and looked at the park for a moment, and then he turned and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. He said, "Cecily, I would like to ask you to marry me." It was not 12 words. It was 9 words, specific and level and entirely without rhetoric. She turned this over, in the way she had turned over the letter in the cold rectory sitting room, because the habit of examining things for what they actually said was deeply ingrained in her. She said, "I want to be sure of what you mean. Not a practical arrangement. Not a kindness." He said, "I have loved you since June. I have been badly managing that fact for 18 months. He said it in the same voice he used for everything, without ornament, and it arrived in the cold November air with all the weight of something that had been true for a long time. She breathed. Behind the stone wall of the parterre, somewhere in the kitchen garden, she could hear Edmund's voice and the housekeeper's answering it, the ordinary sounds of a house in the morning. She put her hand on the balustrade, her fingers settling over a crack in the stone she had noticed one summer morning and never quite forgotten, and she said, "Yes." He did not move for a moment. Then he placed his hand over hers on the stone, his fingers warm in the cold air, and they stood there for a long moment in the pale winter light without speaking, which was, she thought, exactly the right amount. There was a good deal that had to be settled in the weeks that followed. The foundation's funds were restored. The village school received its books in time for Christmas, and the parish poor relief received its first proper disbursement on the 18th of December, in the old Duke's name. Edmund was informed of the change in household arrangements by Gideon himself, and Edmund responded by going immediately to find Cecily and asking whether this meant she was staying, and when she said yes, he looked at the floor for a moment, and then up again, and she thought of the shrubbery. And she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. Henry remained at Hartwell Park through the winter, rebuilding something with his brother that had been interrupted 4 years ago, and required time and cold air, and the particular patience of 2 men who had always understood each other better in the same room than on paper. Lady Dorothea was civil. It was, for Lady Dorothea, a significant adjustment. On an evening in late December, with the first snow of the season settling on the parterre outside the drawing-room windows, Cecily sat at the piano that had been her particular comfort since her arrival, the one she had played in the evenings when no one needed her for anything, and she played without hurrying, the notes falling into the warm quiet of the room. Gideon came in and sat in the chair near the fire, not reading, not attending to any of the documents that were his constant occupation. He sat and listened, in the way he had sat and listened to his brother at dinner, with the quality of a man receiving something he had stopped expecting and had not yet calibrated to the fact of having it. The snow fell outside. The fire moved. On the piano rest, tucked into the score, was a small folded letter in her father's handwriting, one of the last things she had of him. A note written the autumn before he died, commending her to a good life and the keeping of faith. She had carried it everywhere, in the pocket of whatever gown she wore, and she had placed it here, in the score, because here was where she came when the day had been long. She played to the end of the piece. The final chord dissolved into the room. He said from the chair by the fire, not looking up, "Again." She turned the page back to the beginning. Outside, the snow went on settling, softly and without hurry, on the old stone of Hartwell Park,